when I was coming down, this is my first trip to Santa Fe, and I was thinking about New Mexico and things that have influenced me in the world of water, and there are really two things that jumped out immediately. One was I spent 4 years right after college living in India and teaching, and the relationship of people to water in India is very different than in the US, and that had a profound impact on me. The other was a book that I read while I lived in India, which was the Milagro Beanfield War, which takes place, of course, in New Mexico and is all about water. And this is my own dog-eared copy. I think I brought it to and from India, and that, I think, really got me thinking of that water resources is an important topic that was worth pursuing. And so I wanted to give that little bit of background. I think when I meet water people, especially in water efficiency and conservation, there is no formal direct path to achieve this career. People come to it from all different areas and bring a lot of different experience to it. So I want to start off my talk not in the Southwest, but in Seattle. And Seattle is a good example of why it's very important to understand how much water we use and how much water we're going to use into the future. So let's just imagine the year is 1990, and we are all sitting in our desks at Seattle Public Utilities, and our job is to forecast the future water demand for the city of Seattle. So this is the historic record of demand in Seattle right here, starting in 1930 and going up till about 1990. And this was a critical time period for this decision in Seattle because they were just hitting up against their firm yield. So that means that in what they predict as their worst drought year, that's how much water supply they felt that they had. And so in 1990, this was the forecast without water conservation that they had come up with for the city. And I think it's pretty easy. We've just looked at a lot of trend data that Peck showed us, and sure, that line just follows right up. Seems like it's just perfectly normal. That's exactly what you would expect. Well, the long and the short of it, that is not what happened, and this is what happened. The black line is the actual demand. In 1990, they hit a drought period, and they implemented demand restrictions, and demand plummeted. Then, in the subsequent years, it only recovered a little bit, and then dropped further, basically because of the impact of urban conservation in Seattle. And so they were able to reduce that consumption, and it was a huge impact because they were looking at all of these different new supply projects that they were going to have to build in order to meet this new demand. And now what they're looking at is 70 years of additional supply without any new infrastructure development. So that is a significant change. So the history of demand forecasting in Seattle, and frankly in most of the United States, is a history of error, especially over the last 20 to 25 years. And if you look at Seattle, this is their forecast, going back in time. This is a very brave graph because there's not many utilities that are willing to put this out there. But this really shows how they were wrong every single time. And they were usually wrong within a year or two. And that's because they did not anticipate that demand management and conservation were really going to work as well as they did, and that they would have the tremendous impact. So now the more recent forecasts, of course, are almost flatlined, and I would anticipate that perhaps even a declining forecast might be a possibility in the future. So what does it all mean? One of the finance people at Seattle did a back-of-the-envelope calculation when there was a retirement of Al Diedemann, who was one of the leaders of water conservation in Seattle. And they estimated a 725 net present value from the conservation efforts. That basically they'd avoided $800 million of new supply projects, and they'd only had to spend about $75 million to achieve that. So a tremendous benefit all the way around, really. So I think I use this example to show us why it's important, why efficiency is important, and also why it's important to know how much water we're going to use in the future. One of the negatives, if you overestimate your future consumption, all of your revenue forecasts are also tied to that. And so it messes up the entire utility operations because you don't get enough money. If you're more realistic about what your demand is going to be, you're in a much better situation. So the USGS is really the only national organization that collects data on water use in the US. A lot of it is estimated. It's a fairly crude estimate, but it's the best data we have for tracking overall consumption over time. And some of the data I have go to 2010, and there's been an update from 2015 that I'll show you that relates just to the urban sector. But if we look at the long-term trend from the USGS data, let me just point out the yellow is thermoelectric production. That's the biggest use of water right now in the United States, the water that we withdraw from rivers for cooling and evaporation for generating power. The biggest change over the last, in this graph, really is in that sector. And that represents dramatically the move away from coal, which is more water intensive than renewable energy. So I would anticipate that we're going to see additional reductions in the thermoelectric withdrawals. The other thing about that category is it is not entirely consumptive. A lot of that water is withdrawn, used for cooling, and then put back in with very little losses, actually. The red is the agricultural sector, which has not changed nearly as much as the urban or the thermoelectric. It's gone down a little bit, but not the same. And then the blue is the municipal and industrial category. That's all the water that we use in the cities, flushing toilets, all that stuff. And then the purple line is the per capita use. So per capita use, overall, this is like if you take all the water extractions and divide it by the population. Our water use peaked in 1980. And then has really, the per capita use is going down, 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 and really this 2005, 2010 was the biggest decline that we've seen. And I would argue that this is why we're not in a lot worse situation given the climate change, and that we actually have made progress. So if we just look at the blue, the municipal and industrial sector, this is the per capita use. So we see per capita use again peaking in 1980, coming down, and then really declining substantially after 1990 when plumbing codes and things came into effect. But I want to show you the new data. This is, there was an update that was just put out a few months ago that goes through 2015, and this covers public withdrawals, which is really all, it's pretty much municipal and industrial. The categorization is a little bit unclear. But here we can see now that we've really bent the GPCD curve now. So if we look just at public withdrawals, looks like public withdrawals peaked in 2005 and now have been going down. And now our overall per capita use for public use is about the same that it was in 1960. That's not bad. And our overall withdrawals here are about the same that they were in 1990. So we're making progress, I would say, on our water efficiency. One of the things that I'm going to show you with the next few slides is that this is a national phenomenon. It is not limited to California. It is not limited to states that are water short. It is a national phenomenon, and it's largely because of policies and changes that have been put into place to change our plumbing fixtures. So I'm going to show you a series of different examples from urban water providers showing their trends in consumption. And we'll start with the largest provider in America, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, well represented here by Bill McDonald, the only other guy in the room with a tie. And there, you can see this trend. Now, the big jumps, it's important to acknowledge, these occur during times of drought, when there are mandatory restrictions that are put in place. That's where we see dramatic decreases in water use. And then what happens with conservation, there tends to be a small bounce back, and then efficiency tends to keep those demands lower, and then the next drought comes, and you see it reduced even further. So 36% reduction over a 30-year period, that's better than 1% per year. All right, this is a pretty complicated chart. I'll see if I can untangle it for you. This is New York City. And so New York City's time series goes back to 1930, The blue, this is their population. So their population, this is the axis for population if you're curious. So it starts at 6.5 million and it's up here at 8.5 at the top. So their population has fluctuated, including going down from the 70s to 80s and then has been increasing. The black line is their in-city water demand. So this is how much they're selling to customers in New York City. And then there's various different things, periods of water system expansion, what they call drought, which really, it's hard to compare a drought for New York City versus like what you would experience in San Jose. And then two significant events which occurred in New York. One was the decision to establish universal metering to create accountability for water use. And then the other was a massive 1 million toilet program implemented by a guy named Warren Liebold. Whether they truly achieved 1 million toilets or not, it's kind of like the Million Man March. They were close. And they could see from these measures alone, even the complete sort of opposite of population going up, consumption going down. And a decoupling, if you will, of the relationship between population increase and water use. That's a significant change. Another East Coast example, the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority. I just pulled this one off the web. So this shows from 1980 through maybe 2011, their 5-year running average of their MGD coming down, very consistently. Another East Coast example, there's not a whole heck of a lot of water conservation dollars being spent in Massachusetts, I would argue. This is a chart put together by Doug Frost from Phoenix that charts a whole bunch of different cities per capita use. Denver, Aurora, Colorado. Aurora is the second biggest city in Colorado, soon to be the biggest, given their growth plans. Seattle, Eugene, Oregon, Phoenix, and Tucson. All of these cities, very similar patterns in reductions in per capita use. It's not a coincidence. And then finally, I wanted to show Tucson, because this graph for Tucson, I think, points out what Peck was talking about in the importance of storing your groundwater. Tucson was reliant on their own native groundwater. That's the dark blue. They were entirely reliant on native groundwater, and they were having exactly those subsidence issues, and they were having serious problems. Then they made a decision to switch over to Colorado River water, but to do that through banking and through establishing an aquifer storage and recovery program. And they have essentially completely weaned themselves off of native groundwater. The groundwater levels have restored in Tucson, and they now have a giant underground reservoir where they have banked about 10 years' supply, is what they estimate. So they could get not another drop of water, and Tucson could continue for 10 years at this point, based on that banked water. And they continue to be able to bank additional water. They bank water for Phoenix. And so they have a trade agreement so that if the water gets cut, then Tucson would use the banked water, and then Phoenix could pull the water that Tucson would normally take. So again, though, the other thing though that I haven't talked about is the decline in consumption. So that's also been extremely helpful. That's a big chunk of demand that has gone down, and demand in Tucson is now about what it was in 1990. Okay, so why have all these changes occurred? How have we managed to do this? So there's a series of 2 projects that I worked on over the last 20 years called the Residential End Uses of Water. The first one was published in 1999, and the second was just published in 2016. These are studies of where people use water in cities spread across the country. We use flow monitoring technology that records flow that goes into the building every 10 seconds, and then we have software that breaks it down into toilets and clothes washers and faucets and outdoor irrigation. And so there's a lot of nuanced analysis that is possible. The results, these data are very important for utilities that use them to help plan and understand the future of their demand. So if we look at residential indoor demand, gallons per person, this is how much water the typical person uses in their house, just indoors, nothing else. So in the 1999 study, the average person used about 69.3 gallons per person per day for toilet flushing, clothes washing, faucets, all of that stuff. In 2016, that number had gone down to 58.6, so that's about a 15.4% reduction. About a 1% per year reduction in indoor per capita use. Now, we know from another project that intentionally went into homes and replaced toilets and clothes washers and faucets and shower heads, that just by making those technological changes, you can reduce the per capita use down to below 40 gallons. Now, this doesn't require shorter showers. This doesn't require behavior change of any kind. This is just the reduction of the volume of flushing the toilet, the volume of using the clothes washer, and the flow rates. So if you look at the difference between the 2016 and what I would say is a very achievable 36 gallons per person per day, and we may even be able to go lower than that, that's another 37% reduction. So that's twice what we've gotten already on a percentage basis. So I would argue then that there is substantial additional water efficiency just in the residential indoor side. Now we all know there's a lot outdoors, so that's sort of a given. But this suggests that even on the indoor side, we're going to get additional savings. So if you're curious about where the water goes in your house, this is the average breakdown. The toilet is the largest consumer of water in the home on average. If toilets are replaced to a water sense standard of 1.28 gallons per flush, they become the third largest generally. But we're not quite there yet. Formerly, clothes washers were number 2, but clothes washers have gotten a lot more efficient. In fact, clothes washers have gotten more efficient faster than toilets have gotten more efficient. So now showers and faucets are the next highest water use, followed by clothes washers, and then you've got this big category of leaks. That's where we're going to make a lot of progress in the next 20 years. Residential leaks. Without going into a lot of detail about it, it ends up being a very small number of houses that have massive leaks that drag up everybody else. And with new metering technology, it's fairly easy to identify continuous leaks. I think we're going to see utilities taking an active role in alerting customers when they have a problem and taking. So I'm optimistic that that's an area we're going to make progress on. So then other things like the dishwasher, people a lot of wonder, like, is a dishwasher, does it use a lot of water? It doesn't really use a lot of water. They're fairly small. But we did do analysis of people who had dishwashers versus people who didn't have dishwashers. The dishwasher is not a water-saving device. It doesn't reduce the faucet use per se. So we weren't able to show that having a dishwasher actually resulted in reducing water use. If we look just by end use, this shows the comparison from 1999 to the 2016 study for toilets, clothes washers, showers. I've got the whiskers. So when there's a space between these 95% confidence whiskers, that means that we have what we call a statistically significant finding. So when they overlap, like with faucets or with showers, it may look like there's a difference, but not enough that we can hang our hats on and say, wow, we've really seen a change. So the only 3 fixtures that saw this change over this 15-year period were toilets, clothes washers, and dishwashers. And clothes washers turned out to be the biggest change. So what's happened with clothes washers? Clothes washers, the Energy Star program has been working to reduce the energy consumption of clothes washers. Well, how do you do that? You do that by reducing the water consumption, and a lot of times by reducing the hot water consumption. So that the energy efficiency of clothes washers has had the byproduct of reducing the volume of water, and also there's also been work to make sure that occurs also. For toilets, we had in 1992, the Energy Policy Act was signed by George H.W. Bush, came into effect probably in 1994. That basically mandated that only 1.6 gallons per flush toilets could be sold in the United States. And then some years later, we had the Water Sense program start that reduced the flush volume even further to 1.28. So you can't go out and buy a toilet that uses more than 1.6 gallons right now. And if you go to Home Depot, you won't even have that choice. You'll only be able to buy a WaterSense because that's the only thing that they sell. So just looking at the toilet data, one of the questions is important is like, have we seen an increase in flushing? Because one of the things that happened was when the first low-flow toilets came out is they got a really bad reputation. They don't work. You have to flush them twice. Yada, yada, yada. Well, mostly we proved that to be not true, and truly for this study, it's absolutely not true. So the average flushes per person per day, 1999, 5.05, 2016, 5. It's the same. They're really, it's biology. It is not, there's not much more than biology impacting how often you need to flush the toilet. And when we actually did more nuanced research on older toilets, we found out that people double flush the old toilets about as often as they did the newer ones. So, there you have it. The average flush volume, though, is interesting. Back in 99, 3.65 gallons per flush. Now we've reduced it to 2.6. But we know that we have great toilets that can flush within a gallon. So we could replace every toilet in America and go and have a tremendous reduction in flushing down to 1 gallon per flush on average. It's going to take a long time, but I will expect that we are going to get there. So what we saw in the last 15 years was a 22% reduction in average per capita toilet use, but the potential is for another, 50% or more. If we, enact the right policies, if we continue on the path that we've chosen. So hot water. One of the things that the new end-use study, the 2016 study, looked at was hot water. We only had a sample of 94 homes in about 10 different cities for this, but that was a lot more. I think it's about the most homes that have ever been monitored for hot water. So if you're looking for a rule of thumb, you could say that about 1/3 of the water inside a home is hot and about 2/3 is cold. And the big thing that I got from this hot water analysis was that clothes washers don't use very much hot water. And it's actually going down. So now dishwashers are 100% hot water by comparison. Whereas then you see things like showers and faucets really being the largest users of hot water. Those are also the largest discretionary uses of water in the home. So what my takeaway from this is we're going to see additional demand reductions. I'm not sure we're going to see as much reduction in hot water use as we are in overall water use. Because I think that the fixtures, the toilets don't use any hot water, and these are going to be harder to impact. It's going to be harder to get people to make changes in those. We may get there, but it's more of a challenge. On a per capita basis, the shower and the faucets are the biggest. That's 8.1 gallons per person per day of hot water for showering, 7 for faucets, only 2 for clothes washer. 2 hot water leaks, they exist, 1.2 gallons, and then baths going down on down. So how far have we come? How far do we have to go? We set some parameters to try to establish the level of efficiency of the homes that we monitored in 99 and 2016. And so we set a 30 gallons per load volume for clothes washers. 30 gallons is not very efficient. Now you can easily get a clothes washer that'll use 15 gallons per load, certainly 20 gallons per load or less. But in 99, only 6% of the homes even met that 30 gallon per load criteria. Now we're up to 46%. That's real progress. 8.5% of the homes had an average flush volume of 2 gallons per less in 99. Now we're almost up to 1/3 of the homes having an average flush volume. But then it's interesting to look at showering. So the showering flow rate was set in the 1992 Energy Policy Act at 2.5 gallons per minute. 75% of the homes complied with that regularly in 99, and it only went up a little bit in the new study. So relatively small changes in showering. Again, the shower is going to be, I suspect, one of the hardest places to get people to change. People are very attached to their showering. And we're also seeing some new developments in showering that could suggest additional water use with multiple shower heads and various other devices that people seem to want. But anyway, to finish this off, I mean, the key thing here is that there's a huge amount of additional potential even at in these other categories. So I don't want to suggest that fixtures are the only reason that consumption has gone down, because water rates are another big piece of this picture. And I think we all pay the water bill. We've seen how much it's gone up. The average increase of water and sewer has been higher than almost other fixtures. And it's important to understand how much people are paying, and that's a critical part of people's decisions to use water or not. It's difficult to compare water rates, and so for the study, we came up with an approach of trying to estimate what your water and sewer bill would be in these different cities if you used 5,000 gallons, so that's the blue, so that's how much you'd pay for 5,000 gallons in 1 month, or if you used 25,000 gallons. 25,000 gallons would be like a big outdoor irrigation, maybe on a large yard. And so I thought you might be interested to see Santa Fe, which has had historically some of the highest water rates in America. So among the highest on the indoor side, but once you get to 25,000 gallons, second only to Portland for really using that price signal to incentivize reductions in outdoor water use. And it works. I mean, Santa Fe has one of the lowest overall per capita water uses in the country. I think of cities of any size, I think it may be the lowest that's been observed. So it's kind of interesting to see who has low and high rates. It doesn't always correspond to water rich or water scarce. And I'll point out Scottsdale down here for having fairly low water rates. And then some East Coast, Portland, of course, you think about being wetter as having fairly high water rates. Waterloo, Canada, right by the Great Lakes, pretty high water rates. So there is a disconnect, clearly, between the availability of supply and to some extent the rates. So I haven't talked very much about outdoor water use, and that's because the residential end use study, the real power of that analysis is on the indoor side. But I think we did do some analysis to look at how efficient people were in their outdoor water use. And this did create sort of an interesting finding. What we did is we used aerial photography to measure how much of each of the parcels was being watered or irrigated. And then using the climate data, we could come up with a value for, this is a reasonable amount of water that this should be used in a year at this particular house, based on what their landscape and what the climate is. And then we compared that to what they actually used. And what we found is that 70% or more of the homes were way under irrigating. And the largest chunk here were basically not irrigating whatsoever. We had, then another 12% or so that were, pretty much on target. And then this long tail of excess water use, which is another about 10% of the overall group. But the volume that was used by this small group of homes was so large that if you took the average of the whole group, it would be in the excess. So even though that we had all these people using less water outdoors, the over-irrigators basically completely eliminated the savings. So the takeaway here is, if you're sitting there at a water utility thinking about, how do I do an outdoor water program, try to focus on these guys who are way over-irrigating, and don't do anything with these guys. Leave them alone. Don't, because one of the possibilities is you might actually encourage somebody to start irrigating who wasn't irrigating in the past. Okay, so my closing slides are set up to talk about how much more water efficiency can we expect. And I want to say, I think we can expect a lot. I think we're about halfway there. I think we've achieved about half of the low-hanging, readily available water savings. We're going to see new technology coming in. We're going to see increased outdoor efficiency. We are going to see the leak detection from the utility side. The utilities are going to start installing water meters that can be interrogated more frequently than once a month. In fact, they can be interrogated every hour. When you interrogate the meter every hour, then you can determine if the flow never stops, which is a good indication that there might be a leak. And then you have the ability to alert customers and maybe have them take some action. Another area that utilities are really starting to dig in on is water loss control. That is the leakage in water systems. So once the water leaves the water plant and goes into the distribution system, there's substantial volumes of water that are leaked and lost and never make it to the customers, never get sold, there's no revenue associated with it. It's sort of been, historically, it was just sort of swept under the carpet, nobody really worried about it. But now we started to put economic value to that water, and that has made a big difference. And so we're seeing utilities really take that on. This is one where you can see the age of your system has a lot to do with it. You look at the East Coast systems, they're going to be a lot leakier than the newer systems out in the West. But it is a major area of attention. We're seeing a whole group of companies spring up that are trying to work with utilities to bring data to customers, to get them information about their water use, to help them to reduce their water use. And then we're also seeing the idea of peak management. And I want to talk a little bit about peak management. So the peak is the maximum day or the maximum hour of water use. And if you're working for a water utility, a lot of times you have to design your infrastructure to meet that single day, that biggest day of the year. And so the ability to manage that peak could encourage, or it could result in reduced infrastructure costs. So the idea is, well, what if we could take advantage of a cloud network to try and the Internet of Things with water-controlled devices to shape the demand curve to meet particular utility objectives. And so this is a really cutting-edge idea we're just starting to work on. So I've been partnering with a company called Ratio, that's out of Denver, that has an internet-connected irrigation controller. And we did a project actually in New Jersey, where we installed these controllers, and then we informed the customers that we are intentionally going to cease your irrigation on 2 days during the summer for the particular purpose of trying to manage the peak demand. And it worked. And it was a small pilot, but I think it sort of heralded what could be a more connected future. We know outdoor water demand is really what drives a lot of utility infrastructure costs. So the ability to harmonize it, to orchestrate it almost, to the timing, and also the volumes could be significant. So this is really sort of a concept of bringing together the customers and the utility. And that's a step that utilities have been very reticent to make. Most utilities sort of feel like their responsibility ends at the meter. And getting them to do rebates and conservation programs has been, there's been some kicking and screaming involved, I would say. So I'm not 100% convinced that this next step of the Internet of Things is going to go perfectly smoothly, but I think there's a significant potential. And I think customers are going to be interested in approaches that don't mandate you can only water at this day, at this time. I think they're going to be much more interested in approaches that allow them to have a little bit more flexibility. So what are the future trends? We're going to see technological change. Yep. That's already happened, and that's kind of how we've gotten to where we are with demand. The new frontier is going to be also behavioral change. How do we incentivize people to change their actual behaviors? Can we reduce showering time? Can we change people's faucet usage? We're going to, as Peck told us, we are going to have more intense and frequent drought. Maybe it's even just the new normal. Maybe we don't even call it drought anymore. We may experience demand fluctuations, but we also, one of the things about increased efficiency could be that we might see more regularized demand. As everybody converges on a lower per capita use, you may see less annual fluctuation, which might make things a little bit easier from a predictability standpoint. We're still waiting to see. But I do think you're going to see, in order to achieve any water savings, it's going to happen at the retail level. You have to work with customers. You have to work with the people who use the water, really. And water efficiency and demand management is not something that you can just sit at your desk and achieve, or even achieve just through utility best practices on yourself. You have to think bigger and include the people that actually use the water and enlist them as your partners. So with that, I would be happy to answer a few questions. I think we might be over time, so we may need to race along, but I will happy to answer. You know, I'm not an energy expert. I do think there is a tight correlation, and I did read a very interesting report that came out of California that analyzed the reductions in energy use during the drought. They were almost entirely due to water efficiency and reduced pumping.
As an energy geek, I can tell you energy geeks do not talk water use. They believe in talk.
Well, we need to talk. We need to talk, and I mean, because they're clearly related, and the water side, I think, has a huge impact on the energy side. Okay, another question.
Is it an urban myth, or is there some point at which sewer systems need more water to effectively transport solid waste?
Yeah, so it's not an urban myth. You do need a certain amount of flow. What is an urban myth is that we're having a problem. So there's been very few problems moving waste. There's been a few that have been documented. There's one in San Francisco, but it's often related to the design of the sewer system rather than the actual lack of flow. The truth is, there's lots of other flows that are coming into sewer systems that are moving waste along. So that there's been more concern about, rather than the big sewers, the actual moving of waste from the building out to the sewers. And so there's been a series of studies that have looked at that, and they've kind of come down to the area of about 1 gallon, between 0.8 and 1 gallon per flush is about as low as you're going to be able to go, especially in the commercial sector where you have long sewer runs, long runs. In the residential sector, you might be able to go lower because there's other, especially if you design the system cleverly so that faucets and other things, that flow can assist moving the waste. Nasty topic, but it's important.
What is the prognosis of implementing waterless toilets?
So there have been waterless urinals that have, hit the scene. I think certainly the men in this room have experienced a waterless urinal before. The facility managers who I talk to don't like them very much. They actually end up being higher. There's definitely higher maintenance associated with any waterless toilet fixture. So the trend that I've been seeing has been to use like a 1 pint urinal, which is, it achieves, 95% of the water savings, but then doesn't have any of the associated maintenance issues. So off-the-grid homes and places like, where the composting toilets work, so I don't want to suggest that these things aren't possible and don't do things. I think it'll be difficult, though, on a large urban area to go to a waterless type of fixture on a wide scale.
Well, one addition I would say to that is that toilets such as the newest versions of incinerator toilets have a lot going for them, including the disinfection, if you will, of the waste.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very suitable for residential use, and that would have a huge impact on water use. And I'm just wondering, at what point is the public sector opening up to those possibilities?
Well, I think they'll wait until the cost-benefit reaches the point where it's similar to, going down to a 1 gallon toilet. Because generally, utility, and that's sort of the same calculation that's, anyone in your home is going to make. Does it make sense for me to spend, I don't know how much an incinerating toilet costs, but I imagine it's considerably more, and there's got to be some additional work associated with it.
Peter, how about one more question?
One more question. We got a real kick-ass question for the end?
As demand decreases, so does revenue to utilities. What are utilities looking at 5, 10, 20 years down the road to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a big problem. And I'm not convinced the utilities have wrapped their brains around this one fully. Some of the recommendations, the obvious one is to increase the fixed charge. But that has a lot of negative impact on lower income. It's an unfair way, essentially, of raising rates. So there's no simple solution aside from raising the rates. So really, I would say conserve water, don't conserve water, your rates will go up. With that note, thank you all very much.